Hello and welcome back. This is the week 7 lecture. So today we move into Hope Leslie by Catherine Maria Sedgwick, a pretty long novel. I know it's going to be hard for us to get through it in just 1 week, especially considering the fact that many of us might still be working on Edgar Huntley here at the beginning of week 7. So like I said last time, it's okay if it's taking you guys a little bit longer to work through these novels, and Hope Leslie in particular might take you a little bit of time. I think it's a pretty exciting narrative. Sedgwick is a skillful practitioner of the frontier romance, a very important genre that we're going to talk about more today. I sort of got into it a little bit last week when we were discussing Edgar Huntley. I mentioned that even though it's primarily classified as a Gothic romance, Edgar Huntley does possess some qualities, some elements that we would later find in frontier romances, a genre that really became quite popular in the early 1800s. So we're moving ahead in our historical tour. We've spent a lot of time in the 1790s, and now we are moving forward to the 1820s and the second generation of really important American writers. So that's what we'll talk about today. Here in part 1, I really just want to set the stage for Hope Leslie. I want to focus primarily on the frontier romance as a genre. I want to talk a little bit about some other writers who operated within that genre, other members of this second generation that we're going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks. So we'll mention James Fenimore Cooper. We're not actually going to read him, but he's pretty important and we need to know a little bit about his work, even though we're not actually going to read it. He was a contemporary of Sedgwick. They were both writing frontier romances. But as is often the case when I'm trying to choose between similar novels two novels that operate in the same genre and might be doing a lot of the same things, I typically opt for the book that I think is better. I try not to put too much weight on aesthetics when it comes to teaching literature. It's not always about what we like. Sometimes things are important even if we don't necessarily enjoy reading them, but when all else is equal, I will use my own aesthetic judgment to sort of break the tie. So that's why we ended up reading The Coquette instead of Charlotte Temple, and that's why we are reading Hope Leslie instead of Last of the Mohicans, which is the most famous frontier romance written by Cooper. So we'll talk a little bit more about that book and about Cooper because they do matter. And another member of this second generation is Washington Irving, who we're going to be reading next week. Another member is Lydia Maria Child, who we're going to be reading later in the semester. So we're going to learn more about this sort of loose group, this group of second generation American writers that really help to move us forward in the development of a unique national literature. So we'll get into all of that in part 1. I'll sort of set the stage, and then in part 2 of this week's lecture, we'll actually tackle the novel. But I want to just do a few quick housekeeping things first before we get into our real material for this week. So one thing that you guys might notice if you go to our week 7 module and you go into the overview, I've done 2 things in the overview. I've posted a few important terms and concepts from last week from my lecture on Brown. That's kind of the first half of the overview, and then the second half gets us moving on Hope Leslie. I just sort of realized after the fact that a lot of the terms, a lot of the definitions that I was giving you guys last week when we were talking about Edgar Huntley, a lot of that stuff did not appear in the week 6 module in written form. So I thought it might be helpful to have some stuff on the Gothic romance, the romance in general, as a pre-novelistic form of, fictional narrative. I put the sublime in there, a few other things that we were talking about last week in relation to Brown. So don't be confused. We are kind of moving on from Brown here in week 7, but I just wanted to have that stuff in written form so you can have it in your notes so you're clear on it in case you want to do anything with Brown or Edgar Huntley later in the semester. But I also wanted to provide an introduction to Hope Leslie, so that's also there in the week 7 overview. So, like I said, it's okay if you guys are a little bit behind, but at least try to get started on Hope Leslie this week. Just get a feel for what Sedgwick is doing. It's an interesting book in a lot of ways. We're going to use it as sort of a prime example of the frontier romance as it came to be known over the course of the 1800s. So like I've been saying, this is an important genre when we're thinking about the early days of American lit. So we've already talked about some other important genres. We've covered sentimental novels. We talked about the Gothic romance last week, and we talked about that larger history of the romance as sort of, stories that are often fantastical. They often feature adventure, quests, maybe supernatural events, certainly fantastical, sort of unusual events that wouldn't really find their way into what we would think of as realistic fiction. So we talked about how Edgar Huntley really owes a lot to those older forms of romance, and it's also an example of a Gothic romance, which is a more specific genre that emerged in the 1700s in England, and we're all kind of familiar with it, with the castles and the curses. And we have some of those Gothic elements in Edgar Huntley, but of course, he's changing things because now the Gothic is taking place in America. So instead of the castles and the ancient family curses, we have mountains, we have forests, we have a troubled history with Native Americans. So he's using that American material for his Gothic. So that's kind of fun. So now we're going to do something similar this week as we interrogate the frontier romance. As you guys can probably imagine, a lot of American frontier romancers were influenced by earlier British writers. That's a recurring theme as we cover these early days of American lit. But like the best early American writers, like the other good ones that we've been reading, whether it be Foster or Brown, Sedgwick is taking those old forms and she's doing interesting things with them. She is not simply recycling them. She's putting her own original spin on them. And like Brown, like Freneau, like all of these other writers we've looked at, she's using American subject matter. She's using our own colonial history. She's using different regional characteristics that are starting to emerge by the 1820s. And that's interesting. We're going to notice that, and we're going to see that that becomes increasingly common, right? Exploring particular regions of the U.S. People talk in a certain way. People have specific customs, specific types of culture in these different regions, whether it be New England or, the Midwest or the South. We're still familiar with these regional differences even today. That's a big part of America. And of course, it took some time for some of these regional characteristics to really be set down to paper. I mean, they existed. There were differences between regions, even going back to colonial days. If you read Letters from an American Farmer by Crevecoeur, which we mentioned back in week 4, he talks about that. He's traveling in the colonies right before the American Revolution, and he's traveling to different places. He's in New England, he's in New York, he's in the mid-Atlantic, like Maryland. He goes down to the South, he visits Charleston, South Carolina, and he talks about some of the different regional characteristics that he observed. So that stuff was already in existence, but Crevecoeur was probably one of the first to really write about them. And now we move ahead about 30, 40 years or so, and we're an independent country, but we're still young. We still have a sort of young fiction scene, but increasingly the second generation of American writers that really emerges in the 1820s. Sedgwick, Cooper, Lydia Maria Child, Washington Irving, all of them are very interested in exploring regional differences, how different regions of the U.S. have different histories. They might have been settled by slightly different people. That's one thing we're going to notice. It's obviously a Puritan history in much of New England, but if we look at Cooper in New York, Washington Irving also in New York, but different parts of the state, they're exploring different colonial histories. Irving, as we're going to see next week, he's exploring a very Dutch history of upstate New York, very different from the Puritan history of New England. Cooper's in a different part of New York. He's further to the upstate, and he's exploring the colonial past of that region. The colonial past of the South was different. The colonial past of the mid-Atlantic was different. So there's all these different regional sort of peculiarities and eccentricities that we can explore. And we're starting to see that in the 1820s. So this is just some of the raw material that Sedgwick is using in her novel. American history, American sort of regional differences, also sort of American folk heroes, even though she's, making her characters up. I mean, this is fiction that's loosely based on some real historical events, but all of her characters are totally her own invention. But they sort of function as American folk heroes in certain ways. We see the potential for cultural exchange. Something that we've been talking about all the way back to Cabeza de Vaca. Different cultures colliding. These are often violent collisions, but in some ways there is an exchange. There can be learning. There can be sharing. We've talked about the concept of transculturation, this idea that if two cultures come into contact, even if it's not harmonious necessarily, what happens? Does a new culture emerge? A new culture that's part of, that takes parts from both of these older cultures. Is that largely the story of America as we see all of these different groups, often in opposition, but there might be some cultural exchange that results in the creation of new sort of hybrid cultures. So we might be seeing that in Hope Leslie. That's very much up for debate. But we can talk about that. There's at least this possibility of cultural exchange and maybe even cultural mixtures. Although at her time in Sedgwick's era, a lot of readers would have been uncomfortable with some of that, so we'll explore how she navigates those issues. We're also going to see some emphasis on democratic social structures. So like Brackenridge, Sedgwick is interested in our new form of government, how it's going to work, but she's also engaged in this ongoing debate that was really, that we could, trace back to the 1790s. Throughout the era of the early republic, there was a debate about gender and what role women were to play in the new republic. I may have mentioned this text back in week 4, but it's worth checking out if you never have. It's called On the Equality of the Sexes. Came out in 1790, written by Judith Murray Sargent. I'm sorry, I got her name backwards. Judith Sargent Murray. It's one of the texts I listed, I think, when we were going through the early republic. So that's already been out for decades. If you remember, even in The Coquette, there's a conversation involving Mrs. Richmond about what role women should play in the early republic. And Mrs. Richmond is actually sort of advocating for women having a voice and having some degree of, decision-making influence, although you might notice that she's stopping short of saying that women should have the right to vote. In the 1790s, that still would have been a little bit controversial to think that or to say that in polite company. But Mrs. Richmond is arguing that, women do have a voice. Women should play some role. They should be consulted. They should be a part of larger sort of national conversations. And then, of course, their husbands, their sons, the men are going to the polls and actually making the political decisions. But women do need to have a role. Women need to have a voice. And that sort of separates Mrs. Richmond and kind of makes her a little bit more progressive than some of the other women who we see in that novel. And again, a lot of you were picking up on Foster's social commentary. It's subtle. She doesn't come right out and really make a lot of sharp critiques, but a lot of you read The Coquette as sort of an indictment, of patriarchal American culture in the 1790s. It didn't work very well for women like Eliza, and clearly Foster wants us to see that. So I do want you guys to remember that this is an ongoing debate. We're still in the sort of prehistory. We haven't really gotten to a true feminist movement yet in America, but there is a debate about what role women should play. Do they have a role at all in public life? or should they strictly be in a domestic setting? And this book is participating in that debate. Again, Sedgwick is sort of subtle about it. She's not really an outspoken social reformer. She's not necessarily trying to provide explicit social critique, but just in the construction of her story. I mean, just look at the main characters here. Our namesake, Hope Leslie, Magawiska, Esther. They're really functioning as our heroines. And particularly in the case of Hope and Magawiska, they're sort of dual characters. Like they are parallel to one another in a lot of ways. And they are shown to be virtuous. They are shown to be brave. Hope is sometimes headstrong, sometimes a little bit stubborn, but she's morally upright. She's intrepid. She understands things that other members of her sort of conservative Puritan community do not always understand. And she's really our hero, by and large. I would argue Magawiska, too, like she functions in a similar way. But because of some of the outdated racial politics that we can detect here, ultimately Hope is the hero. Hope is the protagonist. She's the romance hero in this particular frontier romance. Again, we're not talking about modern day rom-coms. We're talking about the old romance, which kind of traces its roots back to the medieval period, chivalric romances, knights saving damsels. But notice how Sedgwick is changing the formula. Now, our protagonist is not a knight. It's not a young lord. It's not a nobleman, a typical male aristocrat that we would have found in that role in previous eras. It's a woman. It's a young Puritan woman. And we see a lot of this old New England history through Hope's eyes. She is our conduit to a lot of these episodes, a lot of our adventure, a lot of our excitement. And she is the character who we spend the most time with. And we see a sort of parallel character in Magawiska, another young woman who is intrepid, brave, very morally upright, sort of a moral authority in many ways, and she's a young Native American woman. So an unconventional choice in that regard. Sedgwick is using a lot of old formulas, a lot of these old sort of romance traditions that were pretty familiar to most readers by the 1820s. But again, she's importing them to American subject matter, and she's playing around a little bit with those conventions. She's changing some things as far as the typical romance conventions, and that's fun too. So we can compare her to Cooper, and I would like to do that now. I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about James Fenimore Cooper. Here's his most famous book, The Last of the Mohicans. I actually don't have Hope Leslie with me right now. I left it up on campus in Winnemucca, so I have all of these other books that I wanted to talk about today, but I don't have the actual book that we are reading, so that's a little frustrating, but I trust that you guys can follow along, and I will mention some chapters and some page numbers a little bit later. But let's just talk about the frontier romance, and in the process, we'll talk about Cooper, who probably remains our most famous practitioner of the frontier romance. So let's just talk a little bit about the genre, actually, before we get into some of Cooper's specific work. So I like to frame the historical and frontier romance of early American literature as a sort of forerunner, as a predecessor to what we still have in our popular culture today, often in the form of westerns, stories that we might just call like adventure stories, but we still have a lot of fiction that kind of follow similar lines. So what we have in Hope Leslie is a historical frontier romance about 17th century New England. So again, we're going back to this older colonial history. That's a source of excitement, mythology, and drama for Sedgwick, like it was for some other early American writers. And just notice the subtitle or the complete title of this book, Hope Leslie, or Early Times in the Massachusetts. So again, we're really rooted to a specific time and place here. Okay, we're in a specific region, obviously New England, and we're looking at early times. Now, you might think the 1820s were a pretty early time. This book came out in 1827. But again, Sedgwick is looking further back. She's going back to an older colonial history. Well, James Fenimore Cooper does that too. A lot of frontier romance did that. So think about Westerns. I know a lot of us might not watch Westerns. We might not care very much about the genre. But we are at least somewhat familiar with some of these types of texts. So we can construct a lineage. We can trace that popular genre all the way back to early frontier romances. So Last of the Mohicans is definitely a part of that lineage, particularly the leather stocking character that we're about to discuss. But then we can keep going. You guys might have heard of figures like Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett. These were actually real life people in the late 1700s and early 1800s, but they were sort of frontier heroes. Boone helped to settle parts of Kentucky in Tennessee, so he kind of crossed the Appalachian Mountains and helped to expand the young republic at a time where, most of our settlements were still strung along the Atlantic seaboard. Of course, in the process, he dispossessed and murdered many Native Americans, but the way he was remembered initially, and the way he's still remembered in some parts of the country, and in some people's minds, is as a hero, a frontier hero who helped to tame the wilderness. Again, very much what we were talking about last week with Edgar Huntley. Also, Davy Crockett was a real person from Tennessee. He later went to Texas to fight against Mexico, and Texas's sort of rebellion against Mexico. They used to be a part of Mexico. Davy Crockett was killed in that conflict, but he led this sort of brave group. They stood up at the Alamo. They were defeated, but ultimately the war was won by the Texans. They became independent for a brief time before being sort of incorporated into the U.S. So that's another legend that lives on. Davy Crockett in the Alamo. Remember the Alamo. I don't know if any of you guys have been to San Antonio, where the Alamo is actually located. I've visited before. You can go in there. There's a exhibit. It's kind of cool, but this is all part of our history, but it's also kind of part of our mythology, and a lot of fiction got written about Boone and Crockett and other figures like them. So again, historians, cultural historians, and literary scholars have done a lot of good work already, sort of tracing our Westerns that we know of today back to these earlier figures like Crockett and Boone. I mentioned Benjamin Church at the end of the 1600s in New England, another Puritan, sort of serving in a similar role. He's a frontier hero. He's helping the English to defeat the Native Americans in King Philip's War in the late 17th century, and he becomes kind of an action hero. He's a John Wayne type. So again, we can see that lineage. It continues up until, the late 1800s, where we start to see Westerns in like paperback form. Like we start to see that genre emerge in popular fiction. Stories about Western expansion, Native American conflict, bandits. You guys know some of the archetypes. And then as we move into the 20th century, of course, Westerns become one of the first really popular movie genres, going all the way back to the very beginning of cinema. But again, Westerns were around for a long time. They're still around, but they're different now. I grew up watching a lot of old Westerns. My dad was a big fan. We had all of these VHSs. So we watched old Westerns from the 40s and 50s and 60s. And some of you might have seen some of these films. A lot of them remain pretty famous. Movies like The Searchers, The Magnificent Seven, Stagecoach, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. They're all kind of similar. They all feature heroic white characters. They're often military guys or, brave scouts who have studied the Native American ways, like Benjamin Church, like some of these other earlier examples. And now they're helping to once again, tame the wilderness, establish new civilizations in these previously wild places, which of course was code for, at the time, code for places where Native Americans used to live. But in a lot of the fiction, they were coded or described as wild, uninhabited, the wilderness, dangerous, right? The frontier often thought of as very dangerous, very mysterious, like we saw with Edgar Huntley. But these heroes help to settle the frontier. They help to essentially push out or kill the Native Americans and make things safe for white civilization. That's always what was meant in those types of fictions. So, again, Westerns that we see now, like if you guys saw, it's a really good one. It came out a few years ago with Christian Bale called Hostiles. Really good sort of contemporary Western that's not really romanticizing or celebrating Western expansion in the same way that those older ones did. The ones that my dad liked were usually pretty celebratory. And if Native American characters did appear, they were usually the villains. They were often getting killed. And the only good ones, same went for Mexican characters or African American characters, the only good ones were helping the virtuous, noble white heroes. That was the only way we could tell that these minorities were okay. They got to live. The other ones would have to get eliminated. So that was kind of the narrative, and that's dominated a lot of popular fiction for a good chunk of our history. So frontier romances are a big part of that. So let's just talk about Last of the Mohicans for a moment. Some of you might be familiar with the basic contours of this story. You might have read the book, but you might have also seen the movie, which came out, I want to say, in 1993. There was an earlier version, I think like back in the 1930s or 40s, but I've never seen that one. The one that most people are familiar with is the Michael Mann directed I think it's 93 film starring Daniel Day-Lewis as Leatherstocking. Now, usually I am a book is better than the movie kind of guy, but in the case of this particular text, I would actually recommend the movie over the book. Again, I think Sedgwick is a more interesting writer than Cooper. That's just kind of my opinion. Cooper's very important for his role in our literary history, but the movie is better. The movie's more exciting, and they really capture the main spirit of the novel. They do change the plot a little bit. They cut a few things out. They make it a little bit more streamlined. The novel's pretty lengthy, and you have to cut some stuff when you're adapting it to a film. Films tend to be a little shorter than really sprawling novels. But perhaps the most interesting and important change that the film makes is they convert Leatherstocking, the Daniel Day-Lewis character, into the hero. And this is something that we need to understand about frontier romances. So Leatherstocking is sometimes referred to as a white Indian character type, and later he became so well known that people started to refer to other characters as Leatherstocking type characters. So in later westerns, in later frontier romances, when critics or others would be reviewing or talking about those texts, they would compare those later characters to Leatherstocking, and everybody would know what they meant. So Leatherstocking was not quite the hero, but the most interesting character in a series of novels published by Cooper beginning in the 1820s. I believe the first one was The Pioneers, which came out in 1823. And then 3 years later, in 1826, he published The Last of the Mohicans, and he would publish more Leatherstocking novels, several more. Later in his career, he lived a pretty long time, so he had a long and prolific career. So collectively, all of these Leatherstocking books are often referred to now as the Leatherstocking series or the Leatherstocking tales. You can read a bunch of them. Some of them are good. The Prairie, I believe, is the last one. That's a really interesting one, but the most famous one continues to be Last of the Mohicans. And they have a lot of good stuff in them. I just think Cooper's style strikes us as very old-fashioned today. But the Leatherstocking character is really interesting, and he's important in the evolution. He's important for the evolution of American lit. So he's, again, described as kind of an Indian-like white man, which was a very specific formulation at the time. And it kind of goes back, again, to Benjamin Church, who we talked about weeks ago, this idea of a white person who kind of leaves white society and he goes to live on the frontier and he lives amongst Native Americans and he learns their customs, he learns their language, he learns how they make war. And then, most importantly, in a lot of these fictions, then that character returns to white society in kind of an uneasy way. He's not always trusted by some mainstream segments of white society because he's lived with Indians, right? He's not always trusted. He's rough around the edges. He's not very cultured. He's kind of uncouth in his ways. Can sometimes even be the object of, sort of satire and comedy. We can kind of laugh at some of his uncouth ways. That's certainly the case with Leatherstocking as Cooper presented him. But he plays a very important role. Because of his knowledge of Native American ways, he's able to ultimately assist the white settlers in their military conflicts against the Native Americans. And that's exactly what Leatherstocking does in a lot of Cooper's novels. But it's important to note, he's not really meant to be the hero, because Cooper is using this old romance formula that, again, was sort of handed down from the Middle Ages. And as I mentioned, with a lot of chivalric romances, and even going all the way back to antiquity, and a lot of our earliest narratives, some of our earliest literature, some of those epic poems from ancient societies, one thing we notice is a lot of the protagonists, a lot of the heroes of those stories, well, they tend to be male, and they often tend to be aristocratic. They are nobles. They are well-born. They come from sort of affluent, influential backgrounds, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is probably the first, our oldest, or sort of first example of what we might call literature. The main character, he is literally a king. And we see it in ancient Greek epics, right? A lot of our characters are gods, or they descend from a god, or they are important in various ways. They are, military commanders. They are, important leaders. So this remained true up through the Middle Ages as well. In a lot of those chivalric romances, the protagonists would be noble. They would be aristocrats. They wouldn't just be regular people. So because of his background, Leatherstocking is kind of barred from entry when it comes to being a hero. He's not from the right kind of background. He's actually an orphan. His parents are killed in frontier violence. The action here is in upstate New York. So that's where Cooper sets a lot of his fiction, because that's where he's from. So again, regional histories. Sedgwick is interested in New England, particularly Massachusetts, but Cooper, being from upstate New York, he's documenting a slightly different regional and colonial history. If any of you are baseball fans, or you're at least familiar with the Baseball Hall of Fame, like the physical building, you might know that it's located in Cooperstown, New York. That's in upstate New York. That's where Cooper's from. That town is named after his family. They kind of established the place back in our colonial past. So Cooper was very interested in the history of that particular region. So anyway, Leatherstocking, he's living out there on the frontier. His parents get killed, I think, by Native Americans when he's very young, according to the legend, right? And then he's adopted by an older Native American man. I guess he's not that old initially. And he's raised by this Native American guy who also has a natural-born son. But he's lost the rest of his family. So this adult man, Chingachgook, raises Leatherstocking along with his own son, Uncas. So Leatherstocking sort of regards Uncas as almost a brother, Chingachgook as almost his father. He speaks their language, he practices their customs, but he is a white man. And he is quick to point out to new people that he meets that he is white. in that he is Christian. He still wants to separate himself in some ways from his Native American companions, but obviously he spends all of his time with them. He lives with them in the forest, so he's a stranger to like white society. He doesn't go to town very much. He's not living in the settlements. He's out in the wilderness. So this makes a lot of other white characters not trust him. They don't really know what to make of him. They think that maybe he is a Native American. They're not even sure if he's actually white. But anyway, that's him. That's Leatherstocking as Cooper writes him. But we're supposed to admire him. Like, he's very skilled. He's called the Deer Slayer. Long Rifle is another nickname of his. He's a very skilled hunter and marksman. But what's interesting is he learned all of those skills from Chingachgook and Uncas. So again, he's really steeped in Native American culture in a way that makes him pretty weird in the eyes of a lot of white people. But because of all those factors, he's admirable, he's skilled, he's important, he serves a very important role, but he's not the hero because he's not a nobleman, he's not a gentleman, he doesn't even live with other white people. So he's disqualified from being the typical traditional romance hero. Instead, we get a British army officer who's a gentleman and he's cultured and he's also brave and intrepid, but he has the right kind of background. He's from the right kind of family. He's an aristocrat. So he's the hero. And Leatherstocking kind of functions more like a lovable sidekick, or almost like the foil, a lovable, an admirable foil to the more upright, straight-laced, very English officer who, despite his bravery and all of his good qualities, he's not really familiar with America. He's not familiar with the forests and the mountains that Leatherstocking calls home. So essentially, Leatherstocking, along with Uncas and Chingachgook, they assist the British in their military conflict against the French. So this book is set during the French-Indian War. Some of you might be familiar with that. Pretty big military conflict between England and France during, I'm no historian, I want to say 1750s, maybe up until the 1760s. And it took place in various parts of the world, including North America, where the British and the French were sort of vying for supremacy. So you guys might know a little bit about this colonial history. The French were in Canada, right? And they had also, established some settlements in parts of the modern day U.S. So they were in parts of upstate New York. They were in parts of New England. They had forts and settlements in the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes region, states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. If you ever go to those states now, you'll still meet some people, a fair number of people with French last names. There were a lot of French up there. They were even as far down as Pennsylvania. Modern day Pittsburgh started its life as a French fort before the British took it over. So this is just all part of our colonial past. So the French-Indian War took place before the American Revolution. So American colonists were, for the most part, fighting on the side of the Brits. But a couple of decades later, that would, of course, change. But Leatherstocking is an American. He's from upstate New York. But he is assisting the British, and of course his Indian companions, family, they're also assisting the British. So that's an important thing to remember also about these early conflicts with Native Americans. Often different tribes would align themselves with different European powers. So in the French-Indian War, some tribes were fighting with the British, and some tribes were fighting with the French. So most of the enemies that have to be vanquished in this novel are the natives fighting alongside the French. And of course, they are often depicted as bad. They are immoral. They are, the most violent, the most destructive characters we see, whereas the natives fighting with the British are depicted as more admirable, more civilized in Cooper's mind. And that's all pretty predictable. But his plot does make for some good adventure. It's a good frontier romance. And again, the movie captures a lot of that, cuts out some of the less interesting stuff, but they change the nature of Leatherstocking and the British officer's role. So in the film, Leatherstocking is clearly our hero, and the British officer, though he's not a bad guy, he's kind of depicted as this bumbling, sort of out-of-touch figure who really doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know what he's getting into out here, and it's really Leatherstocking who's running the show and sort of calling the shots, and it's ultimately Leatherstocking that gets with the girl. He gets the girl, he gets the glory, he gets the typical hero's treatment that in traditional romances could never have been given to a character like that. So that makes sense though, right? Times change. We don't need our heroes to be aristocrats anymore. In fact, in American literature, we really moved away from that pretty early on. But Cooper wasn't exactly the world's biggest fan of democracy. He is an earlier writer, so in his time in the 1820s, there was still some nostalgia. For England, for certain aspects of British culture, we still were kind of culturally aligned with them in a lot of ways, even though we had fought 2 wars against them in pretty recent memory. But that's the basic gist of The Last of the Mohicans. So that basic kind of storyline, those character types, again, they stay with us, and the Leatherstocking figure would get used by a lot of other writers and a lot of other texts, and in time, he moves from being a supporting character to being the star. Even Cooper kind of figures it out. By the end of the Leatherstocking series, Leatherstocking really is the main character. We eventually lose the Brits, we lose the old world gentlemen, and it really does become about Leatherstocking and other Americans. He eventually starts a family. He becomes a little bit more conventional. And then the later books, he eventually has to leave New York because upstate New York is getting too settled. It's becoming too urban. And he misses the old forests. He misses the old kind of Indian way of life. So he leaves New York and he pushes west to what is now like, I think, modern day Nebraska. Like in the early 1800s, that's when the later novels are set, and he's trying to make a new life out there in a place that's still kind of wild, because Cooper continues to remind us he's kind of wild. Leatherstocking is wild. He's not comfortable in cities or towns. He wants to live close to nature. He wants to continue to practice some of these Native American customs that, are getting harder and harder back on the East Coast to maintain. So it's kind of a delicate dance. Like, Cooper is romanticizing certain aspects of Native American history, and he is showing us that Leatherstocking has a real love and regard, not just for Uncas and Chingachgook, but other aspects of their culture, of their history. However, right, he eventually has to leave them behind. He has to kind of participate a little bit more in mainstream white society, and his preferences and his way of life make him sort of unfit for a modern U.S. And that's a really important theme that pops up in a lot of literature from the first half of the 19th century. The country's changing rapidly. So what happens as we become a more settled, urban society? What happens to all these backwoodsmen like Leatherstocking, all these guys that made their living in the woods, fighting Native Americans, helping to found new towns? What happens to them when we don't really need the frontier stuff anymore? We don't need them to continue to fight natives. We don't need them to continue to create new paths through the wilderness. This was something that really interested a lot of American writers. What do we do with these guys? And if you watch some of those Westerns from the sort of classic era of Hollywood, like mid-20th century, that question remains. A lot of the John Wayne characters kind of fit that bill. They're fighters. They're rough and tumble. They want to be out on their horse in the desert because, of course, later we're moving further west, right? So in the 1760s, New York is the frontier. 100 years later, Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, that's the frontier. But the basic sort of narrative structure stays the same, even though our geography is moving west as expansion continues. It's the same idea. John Wayne and the other characters like him, he's a real person, of course, but like the characters that he plays, oftentimes, like they're soldiers, they're fighters, they're guides, they're hunters, they're trappers. They love the wilderness. They can't live in a town. They can't be conventional in that way. So what do we do with them? As we modernize as a society, what do we do with those guys? They're kind of violent. They're a little bit antisocial. They don't fit in well in polite society. So what do we do with those guys? And some really interesting, what we sometimes call revisionist Westerns that we start seeing around like the late 60s into the 70s as our culture is really changing with the Vietnam War and hippies and the civil rights movement. And there's starting to be this questioning of like, wait, why do we like these guys so much? Like, should we celebrate these types of characters so much? And increasingly, with the Westerns and other frontier fiction that started to come out over the course of the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and all the way up till today, it's more ambiguous. And a lot of these guys kind of turn bad. They become outlaws because they can't subordinate their violent, lawless tendencies to a new kind of world order. They can't get settled. They themselves aren't really civilized. They helped to spread white civilization, but they themselves aren't quite civilized. There's this great book, a scholar that I had to read years ago named Richard Slotkin, who writes a lot about this, and he has a book. He had several books about this, Gunfighter Nation, all these different books about this character type and how this leather stocking style character type really, shows up in so much American fiction and so much American popular culture. And he coins this phrase called the backwash of the closing frontier. That's always stuck with me. And he's describing characters like Leatherstocking, like a lot of the John Wayne characters. Like, once the frontier is kind of closed and gone, these guys almost become a problem because we don't have a place for them. So they often turn to crime, or they're just sort of disruptive. And that plays out sort of in the real history of the Old West. If you kind of move to the second half of the 1800s, we're not covering that period. But again, this is the prehistory. This is the foundation for a lot of stuff that we're going to see later in classic Westerns and even in more contemporary Westerns that are even more interested in the violent tendencies of these frontier figures and what happens to them after there's no more war. There's no more conflict on the frontier. They almost become men without times, without places. So anyway, that's just a little bit of background. And Cooper became very popular during the 20s. And again, let's talk about this group, this larger group of the second generation of American writers that we've already mentioned. So we've looked at the first generation. We've already sort of covered some key figures from the first generation. Susanna Rowson, who wrote, our first bestseller, Charlotte Temple. Also Hannah Webster Foster, Freneau, Brackenridge, and most recently Charles Brockton Brown. So those were kind of the first native-born American writers. They were all working in the 1790s. Some of them continued to write up until, the first couple of decades of the 19th century. But now we've moved to the 1820s. And with Sedgwick and Cooper and Child and Irving, we have a new generation. And one key difference between the second generation and some of those first generation writers that we looked at through the first few weeks is that the first generation, they lived through the American Revolution. Many of them were adults or like young people during the Revolution. In the case of Freneau and Brackenridge, they both served during the Revolution. Freneau was in the Navy. I want to say he was like captured by the British at some point and then later freed. Rowson, who, as we mentioned, is our first best-selling author, she was born in England, lived for a good while in America. Her father was a British naval officer. So when war broke out, they had to leave Massachusetts. I think that's where they lived. They had to leave Massachusetts. He obviously was pressed into service. She went back to England. She was like a teenager. And then later she would come back to America as an adult. But that first generation, they lived through the war. And many of them had at least a distant memory of what life was like before the war. They had at least a distant memory of the colonial times. And they had a lot of experience, firsthand experience with the American Revolution and the immediate aftermath. But the second generation that emerges a few decades later, they're different, right? They were either born maybe during the revolution, right before it, or maybe even right after it. So they don't have a memory of colonial America. They might not even really remember the revolution that well. They might have been alive, but they were probably very young. So they grow up, the second generation, they grow up in the era of the early republic. They're coming along during these sort of formative years as we're trying to create a unique culture, as that literary scene is beginning to emerge at the beginning of the 1800s, like we were talking about last week with Brown. So we've already seen, figures like Brackenridge and Brown and Freneau, they were laying some of the foundations. They were creating literary magazines and publishing fiction, in the 1790s. We can even go all the way back to Anne Bradstreet and the very beginning of literary production in America. But it just takes time, right? And by the time we reach the 1820s, we have some foundations to work with, thanks to those earlier writers that we've already looked at. So figures like Sedgwick and Cooper, they can build on what's already been done, but they can also begin to innovate a little bit more. And they have a little bit more history to draw upon. I mean, it's always an interesting thing to observe with humans. We have this sort of universal tendency to be nostalgic about things that have passed. It's a strange phenomenon. But again, remember, this is a group of writers who don't really have a direct memory or any direct experience with our colonial past. So they're already sort of becoming nostalgic for our colonial past. Even as early as the 1820s, we're starting to look back. Pre-revolution, we're interested in our history, we're interested in our origins. What was life like for our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents? So yeah, Cooper is going back not even a full century. From his vantage point in the 1820s, he's going back to like the middle of the 1700s to explore that particular episode of colonial history as it played out in New York. So again, the French Indian War largely played out in Canada and in the future U.S. states that border Canada, like New York, Vermont, the upper Great Lakes, but there was also some action as far south as Pennsylvania. But ultimately, the British won that war, and what that meant was that they were able to consolidate their control over the future U.S. It's not like all the French people had to leave, but France was no longer a real political or like military threat to the English colonization efforts in the future U.S. But of course, as we know, that stability would not really last long because just a couple of decades later, the American colonists rebel and we have another war on our hands. But that's the history that Cooper's going back to. Sedgwick is going back to an even older colonial history. So she's going all the way back to the immediate aftermath of the Pequot War, which broke out in New England back in the 1630s. So when our action sort of begins, I think the war has just ended. And I believe the war actually ended in 1638. So we're talking about the very beginning of English colonization in New England. So we've already talked about this era a little bit when we were going through our historical tour back in week 4. So I mentioned King Philip's War and Benjamin Church. That was the biggest military conflict between English settlers and Native Americans in New England. It broke out later. I want to say 1660s, maybe 1670s. But that was the definitive turning point, at which point it was clear that the English were not going anywhere. They really had their foothold in New England after King Philip's War, and really there was no more substantial organized Native American military resistance in New England after King Philip's War. So we talked about that in relation to Benjamin Church and the text that came out about him later. But the Pequot War happens much earlier. So we're several decades before King Philip's War. And this, the Pequot War was one of the first significant conflicts to break out between English colonists and local Native Americans, in this case the Pequot tribe. If you've ever read Moby Dick, they are the tribe that lends their name to the ship, the famous ship that we find Ahab and Ishmael on. But anyway, so again, there's a deep, long history there in New England. The Pequots, you can still find people of Pequot descent in Massachusetts. They've been there for the duration. So we're going back to this particular point in history. If you remember when we were talking about Bradstreet, well, we mentioned that she came over in 1630 as part of John Winthrop's group. Winthrop was the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they came over on the Arabella. Bradstreet, her husband, and several others came over in 1630 to start the Massachusetts Bay Colony in modern-day Massachusetts. So we're in that same era here. And in fact, I believe William Fletcher, the father, the sort of adopted father of Hope, I think he's supposed to have come over on that same, on the Arabella. He was supposed to be a member of John Winthrop's party, his expedition. And Winthrop, we've already mentioned him. He was like the first governor of the colony. He was a very important figure. He becomes a historical, he's actually in the novel. He's one of the historical figures that does show up in the novel. Most of these characters are fictional, but we do meet Winthrop. He is a real figure. He was the author of that City on a Hill speech, which is very famous. We talked about that back in week 4, sort of establishing this early thread of American exceptionalism. And again, kind of based on Puritan typology, right? The Puritans felt like they were playing out events from the Bible. They were the modern day Israelites in the wilderness, promised a new land by God. And here it is. We have to settle it. So they were finding those parallels between their own experiences and biblical events. And that's part of how they viewed themselves and how they viewed the significance of their colonizing efforts. So we're using real history here. It's important to notice that we are using real history. We do meet some real figures, though again, mostly fiction. And Sedgwick is very interested in the history of this era. She also kind of gently interrogates her own Puritan ancestors. We're going to talk about that more in part 2. But again, this is a slightly unconventional frontier romance, not in terms of plot, not in terms of subject matter, but in terms of emphasis and maybe point of view. She lets her women characters take center stage. And again, the women characters, largely Hope and Magawiska, but maybe also Esther a little bit later on, they function as our protagonists for the most part. I mean, Everil is also an important character, but really a lot of our perspective gets filtered through these important women characters. And again, Sedgwick is telling this story of early colonial times from the perspective of women. That alone makes this kind of a novel, different approach. But remember that larger debate about gender. Another thing Sedgwick is doing here by changing the romance formula a little bit and putting the focus on female characters, she's also showing that women played a huge role in the shaping of our nation, the founding of our nation, which was something that not everybody would have necessarily believed or thought about during this time period. So that's probably enough foregrounding, that's enough background, I should say. That's enough context. So let's end part 1 here, and then we'll come back in part 2 and really jump into the novel.